Anna Kasparian, welcome onto my small program on Twitch.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. I actually I love your show. I wish I had more time to watch more Twitch content, but lately things have been a little crazy and I haven't been able to like do much viewing for pleasure. Like I like to keep up with other people's content and like just people who like share a little bit of their lives along with talking about stuff that's going on in the world. It's so different on Twitch compared to what I do, and I love it. Like I love the more casual nature of it. But things have been a little crazy lately. So I came across your videos during a time when I felt pretty isolated and alone, and you were one of the very few people who had the I don't know, the courage to kind of speak out and defend me as Jimmy Dore's goons were coming after me. And I just really, really appreciated that.
I that honestly that is one of the more shocking things because like I haven't been directly involved in the discourse, but it is strange to me how many people have been taken in kind of by this Jimmy Dore um, grift. Like it's pretty obvious to me now, like as I've watched a little bit more of his content, that like he is just disingenuous almost 100% of the time. And I'm so sorry for everything you've been going through. I'm sure it's still happening too. um
Yeah, I mean, I've gone through so many different phases of awful things happening to me personally that as we were kind of like at the peak of the stuff about the sexual harassment getting out and him doubling down on it and like furthering his humiliation of me, like that part was definitely difficult. But what was even harder was like watching all of these people around me either stay quiet because they were so afraid of him targeting them, or in like certain specific cases, people defending him mostly because they're terrified of him. Like just repeating this notion that I was like blackmailing Jimmy Dore, which is hilarious. And so that was definitely difficult. But I will say, people always show you who they are, right? And so I think in the beginning, some people might be a little skeptical of claims against their favorite, YouTuber or content creator, but Jimmy can't help himself, and he just kept showing his own audience who he is. And I think that he's definitely lost a lot of the left wing audience members. You know what I'm saying?
mhm, mhm.
Especially with like, it's funny, like the Kyle Rittenhouse stuff that he's been putting out. All of a sudden, I'm seeing some of his viewers say, like, you know what? Now he's lost me. Now he's
Yeah.
lost. It wasn't the like the open like sexual harassment comments. It wasn't the nonstop vaccine garbage that he puts out there, anti-vaccine garbage. It's now finally the fact that he's making Kyle Rittenhouse to be some sort of like Boy Scout. That they're like, oh, turns out Jimmy Dore might have some issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Did you pay much attention to the General Strike Summit that he was kind of headlining
No,
at
I
all?
didn't. Because he's not a serious person. And a
No.
general strike is not a toy, it's not some sort of game. It's something that actually takes a lot of groundwork and a lot of organizing and a lot of union power, which we don't have yet. And so there needs to be an infrastructure in place to make workers whole as they do a general strike because people have bills to pay, they have kids to take care of. And for him, it's a prop. And I just think like all of that is pretty gross.
Oh yeah, I tuned in for maybe just a fraction of it, and there were people on there just saying that like getting the vaccine is essentially complying with slavery, and it's just like these aren't
God.
serious people. These aren't serious people, and I'm glad more people are finally waking up. It always seems like there's this cycle where people just see, particularly women, thrown under the bus and kind of just turn a blind eye to it before, like, another issue 10 months later, like, oh yeah, that person was bad. Like,
Yeah.
I just wish it didn't take the suffering, or the pain of women as being like one of those initial wake up calls, I guess.
Yeah, the thing that I find kind of fascinating is I think about and even feel awkward referring to it as fan base. Like I think about my viewers and listeners, and even like the most, I guess, committed viewers and listeners, people who have been with me for like over a decade at this point, and none of them are so-called stans, right? Like I
Hmm.
feel like my viewership is kind of like fickle in that if I mess up, they know it and they'll tell me, and if I keep messing up, they're gone. And I
Hmm.
appreciate that. Like I want to have a smart group of people watching the show. But I do find it interesting that like people like Jimmy Dore, and he's not the only one. There's many like him. They tend to get the benefit of the doubt, like, and they have rabid so-called stans who support them no matter what. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what is it about these figures who get endless benefit of the doubt? Whereas, I don't get everything right, but if I don't get something right, I'm going to correct myself, as humiliating as that might be. And I feel like good behavior doesn't really get rewarded in this industry at all,
Y-
right? Like it's
yeah.
amazing to me, like how much I feel like I get punished, or how much people make assumptions about my character just based on nothing, just based on speculation.
Yeah, it is interesting how I think that there is a perception of correcting oneself or like apologizing for getting something wrong, that while it's more intellectually honest, there are some people out there who view that just as weakness, and
Yeah.
they just want, not they don't want actual like information, they just want the appearance of somebody who is strong intellectually, even if that is absolutely not the case.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, and I mean, for me personally, I think strength is being able to admit that you're wrong, right? And for me, like, there are two different groups of people who do news. There are people who actually like want to inform their audience. And so you got to correct the record if you've got something wrong. Like it's a moral and ethical obligation. And then there's a group of people who do it for entertainment, for money, whatever purpose. But like actually informing the audience is not the priority. That's like kind of something that takes the back burner. And so like I don't do things to be courageous or to
mhm.
get cookies or brownie points. Like I do it because I like the thought of me misinforming the audience, like that kind of stuff keeps me up at night. Like I feel tremendous guilt. And
Yeah.
I think it takes courage to like raise your hand and humiliate yourself by saying, hey, actually, I should have done a better job with this story or with this issue. And I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't do enough research. I got it wrong and I want to correct the record. I think that's admirable and that actually takes a lot of strength, but it's not seen as strength. So I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I definitely am with you. I would prefer an audience that helps keep me accountable and
Yeah.
makes sure that I'm at the very least in the realm of reality. And I think making these appeals to kind of like, I don't know what the term I would use for it is, but like strength based punditry.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that is one of those catalysts that can lead you out into just like fantasy worlds, along with your entire audience. And
Hmm.
I don't know, that's something that's recently been really concerning to me, just watching like the rise of QAnon. And I've been delving more into like American right wing extremism, and just like these, there are entire cultures. Like the other day, I learned about what's called the American Readout, which
Hmm.
is like the movement to turn Idaho into like a super state and then secede from the United States. And like there is just there, like the fantasy worlds that people are constructing for themselves in right now are powerful and scary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that worries me the most is all these terrible things are happening, and we're seeing people getting radicalized in terrible ways, and they're going in terrible directions. They're cutting themselves off from their own family members and stuff. And you think about possible solutions and what the reaction or response to that should be. And I've always thought, like, you know if someone is hateful or racist, like I don't know if there's legislation that can change that, right? So
Hmm.
what should the Democrats, for instance, do to respond? And the only thing I can think about is when are people the happiest, right? And because right now Americans are not happy, right? There's a lot of pain in the country, there's a lot of stress in the country. People are overworked or living in extreme poverty. They might be addicted to opioids. That's still an ongoing epidemic that isn't being addressed. Like people are really struggling and suffering, and when they experience that in their personal lives, they tend to look for escapes,
Hmm.
and that's when they're much more vulnerable to being radicalized, right? And I think a lot of the people who do get radicalized, who join these extremist groups, it's very similar to what you see with gang activity or gang behavior. They're searching for a sense of community and a sense of belonging.
Hmm.
And so the only thing that I can see Democrats do that would be effective is to really improve the material conditions of everyone. And they're not doing it. And it's
No.
making me crazy. They're not fighters. Like I've gotten to a point where I'm just so furious with the Democratic Party. Every time I come across a story about the Build Back Better agenda, like I just roll my eyes and ignore it because it's like, what's the point?
Right.
You know?
It has been cut down so much. It's almost insane that we can even call it the same bill. That we can use the same name for it. Um, like what do you see? Like it is hard. I know for a lot of people who watch me to not fall into kind of these pits of like hopelessness
Right.
and to when they see all of this happening and I like personally I don't see 2022 going very well or possibly even 2024 with the way the Democrats have been running things. We had a perfect opportunity here for great sweeping change that could potentially lay the groundwork for more victories in the future, but that's just not happening. So like, where do you find your strength? Where do you find like hope looking at the future?
So there are two things that I try to like shift my focus onto whenever I get that feeling of hopelessness, which by the way has been pretty intense lately. The first thing that I try to do is think about what I can control and what I can't control. So I think I tend to take responsibility for things that I obviously can't change unilaterally.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to like take a step back and be like, listen, I'm doing my part as best I can. But here are the things that I can actually control. And it's really just my immediate environment and also my own personal behavior, right? So, as cheesy as it sounds, like be the change you want to see in the world is very much, I think, a smart strategy. And I think, like, I try to reach, I don't want to say across the aisle because that's a super cheesy way of putting it. Um, I'm trying to understand the other side as long as they're not like rabid extremists. I did a debate with Ben Shapiro recently,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing that was really shocking and enlightening for me in that whole experience was there's like a whole group of conservatives out there who actually do not subscribe to the Trump era of republicanism.
Mm-hmm.
And they're people I disagree with politically, no question about that. But you talk to them and they're actually decent people who do want equal rights for everyone. Yeah, they might have economic policies I disagree with, but they're decent people that I can at least have a debate or a conversation with. Like I
Yeah.
was all of a sudden exposed to those people because of the debate I did with Ben Shapiro. That gave me a little bit of hope because I think that there's like a whole cottage industry in the media that profits handsomely off of exacerbating divisions or sensationalizing divisions in the country. So I try to think about that, how sometimes we're kind of like taken out of reality and we end up buying into the sensationalized stuff. I try to find gratitude in the things in my immediate environment that make me happy, like my dog, my partner, like all of that stuff. Spend a lot of time with my family, like my parents. They're still alive, and I feel really grateful for that. So
Mm-hmm.
I try to look at like the little things that we tend to either ignore or take for granted because we're so focused on like national level politics. But we got to find positivity where we can get it. And so again, like I just shift my focus to that whenever I start feeling like I'm drowning, which lately has been often.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Um, So here's one of the questions I had, that chat is also now asking, um, but for a long time you've kind of come across, and I don't know if this is accurate, but as like probably one of the more left wing hosts on TYT.
Yeah.
Um, what radicalized you? Like what got you to that point? You know?
Yeah. One person. That's a little unfair. I'll say two, but the main person was, you know, the late Michael Brooks. He and I were very close, and I didn't even realize. Like, it's funny because before he and I became very close, I thought I was pretty left wing, right? And when people would accuse TYT of being libs, I'd be like, I don't get it. How are we libs? Like, we want to decommodify healthcare. We obviously talk about all these social issues from a super left wing perspective. But I guess, I didn't have a critical thought process in regard to capitalism. And I guess I had drank the Kool-Aid regarding capitalism being part and parcel of the United States and how it could never change. So my thinking was always, what can we do to regulate it? What can we do to, keep it under control? But I had never allowed myself to kind of expand my mind and think about what a socialist society would look like. And so the more I started exploring that because of Michael and because of how non-judgmental he was so warm, so open. We had all sorts of debates and conversations about these issues, and that opened my mind. And so now all of a sudden, I just see politics very differently. I think even from Cenk Uygur, like I think he's got the best intentions, and I think that he's at the end of the day, he wants the same things that we want.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that what's become more and more clear to me is that strategically we're very different. And I'm trying to delve into that a little more on the show. He still thinks that the way forward, the best path forward, is through electoral politics. For me, I'm not going to say I've completely given up on it, but I'm very close. For me, it's like, no, look at this country's history. We didn't get real gains for workers
Mm-hmm.
by electing the right people. That was a small part of it, but there was a tremendous amount of pressure toward the Roosevelt administration by organized labor. And without that, I just don't really see a path forward, which is why, to answer your earlier question, the other thing that gives me a little bit of hope is what we've been seeing with the John Deere workers, like
Mm-hmm.
engaging in that strike that ended up being incredibly successful. I mean, we got to take our wins where we see them, and I think that's an example of what could be a very successful strategy moving forward. I think the thing that kind of turns Cenk off to that is that it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work, and I think he wants like results now.
Yeah.
But I think we've seen through electoral politics that you don't get the results right away
Mm-hmm.
because no one's really accountable to us.
Yeah, Noam Chomsky said something along the lines of, show up to the ballot box, once every 4 years or whatever, but then roll up your sleeves and get back to work. Like,
Yep.
this isn't like I do think there is a tendency for people to like either go all in on like anti-electoralism and just not participating whatsoever, and to focus on building up you know local support, or just go all into electoral politics. And the reality is it takes both. You need
Yes.
you need to exert whatever political pressure you can, and that includes at the ballot box. And um,
Totally.
it does seem like it has been a struggle, especially for like the last year or so, just like engaging with elements of the left that are completely anathema to engaging with the idea of like voting, which is
Yeah.
wild. To me, that seems like cutting off your nose to spite your face. Like it.
100%. Yeah. For me, I mean, the way that I see it is the electoral process is a small part of what we're trying to accomplish, but you could either dig yourself into a deeper hole or keep yourself at ground level while you try to make progress through building labor. That's the way I see electoral politics. So it's like, why would I advocate for actions that will make the process for change even more difficult, right? Like,
Mhm.
there is no path for a third party, certainly not right now. I'm not going to throw away my vote and essentially help to get a Republican elected. But with that said, I'm going to vote strategically and also not engage in these unbearably boring debates about whether or not we should vote for the Democrat or I just, at this point, I find it super boring. And it doesn't surprise me that the people who love to engage in that debate and they make it their entire identity are now all of a sudden like right-wing mouthpieces.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not interested in hearing what their strategy is, because clearly they don't have one. And whatever they have said in the past was very intentionally meant to put us at a disadvantage. So they can F off. Yeah.
um, Also, so one of the things I did want to ask you about is the state of like journalism today. I know that's a really broad question, but you have these massive conglomerates buying up local news stations, local newspapers, the consolidation of hedge funds behind the various news networks, both in like the entertainment industry, but also in like when it comes to politics. And you have billionaires that exert a lot of pressure over reputable newspapers, and it is frustrating that one of the most watched news networks in the world is Fox News,
Right.
and like they Fox News will simultaneously present itself as news and then go to court and say, no reasonable person would interpret this as news. And what I, what do you see as the major problems with how journalism is being conducted today, and do you see like a path forward to improve this, to salvage this in some way?
Funny enough, I think a lot of the solutions that we should be implementing are solutions from the past. So, journalism really started to devolve in the 1980s after the Reagan administration destroyed what was left of the Fairness Doctrine. And so journalism used to be seen as a public service as opposed to what it's seen as today, which is a vehicle for profit, a business endeavor. Like, that's really what journalism has become. When it used to be considered a public service, there were certain regulations in place that I thought were not only necessary but critical for the survival of good reporting. Because, for instance, if you did broadcast news and you needed a broadcast license to do the news, you had to abide by certain regulations that led to fairness in your reporting, right? So, if, for instance, I'll give you a specific example
Mm-hmm.
that would actually probably irritate me a little, but at the end of the day would have been a great thing, right? If I'm doing a critical piece on Tulsi Gabbard, I would have to hit her up and be like, listen, we're doing a piece on you, but we need to give you an opportunity to comment. So it's not one-sided, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And so you have to, like, yes, provide both sides, but more importantly, that by itself was the objective part. Then it kind of frees up the journalist to do his or her reporting without fearing about like not being fair or whatever, right? Not being objective. You're giving both sides a chance to speak their piece. And so you don't have to play this game that I see a lot of journalists play today, which is like this confusing objectivity with neutrality,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like there's a lot of neutrality that doesn't end up leading to objective reporting, and it's a huge problem. But more importantly, like the Fairness Doctrine prevented Rush Limbaugh from being Rush Limbaugh until it was repealed, and then Rush Limbaugh took off,
Right.
because you can say whatever you want. Now news is seen as something that's only meant for a profit motive as opposed to a public service, and it's a huge problem. So you look back at, like, there was a time in this country, believe it or not, in the years where our parents were coming up, where things were actually pretty good. Like, they weren't perfect. We clearly have always had issues with racism, sexism, xenophobia. Like, that's always been an issue. However, it is fascinating to see how politicians would talk about immigration in the 1980s versus today.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you listen to, let's say, a debate with George George Bush and Ronald Reagan on the topic of immigration, they sound like two liberals. And that's because the country back then, I think because of how most people were economically prosperous, were just less hateful. And I don't know, just a lot of the stuff that made the country a decent place to live, they all got repealed by Republicans, and now we find ourselves in the position that we're in today. And I'm sorry I'm rambling. I just have a
No,
lot to
no.
say.
Ramble away. So you like one of your solutions would be to bring back the fairness doctrine.
Yeah.
Are there other solutions that you have in mind, or is that like just an example of one of the big ones? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, no, no worries. No, I think that in terms of policy, that's the big one. And then on a personal level, I think that there's stuff that can be done. And so going back to what I was saying earlier about trying to keep an open line of communication with people I disagree with, you know, there was a period of time, I would say like 2016, 2017, where if I disagreed with someone's politics, like I would actively avoid them. And that includes people like in my family, on my husband's side of the family. And I was just like, no, they're bad people because we disagree. And I realized how I'm actually hurting myself in doing that, because keeping an open line of communication provides an opportunity to do what Michael Brooks did with me, right? You plant a seed. You show your political opponents the kind of decency and kindness that their political opponents have, right? And I think as soon as and I don't know if this will ever happen, honestly, things seem pretty dire, but I think as soon as we start seeing each other as fellow Americans, as humans, like I think that's when things can get better, right? That's when you can maybe counter the narrative that you're seeing from extreme right-wing media, because you're an actual living, breathing human being who has personal interactions with someone who disagrees with you politically, and you just have a better opportunity at like debunking the garbage, you know?
Yeah, I actually have similar experiences because I used to be very, very conservative
Oh, I
growing
know
up.
that.
It was basically it stemmed from a lot of lack of education on a lot of topics, um, and then I slowly started seeing a lot of the injustices in society, started seeing a lot of the hypocrisy in a lot of the conservative belief systems that I had like kind of held to, and then I transitioned. I realized I was trans, and I transitioned, and I have found that there are so many people who are and like very against transgender people, but often they are very against transgender people because they've built them up in their heads as like these like monsters almost. Like they've in their mind they've never met a transgender person, and because they've never met one, it's really easy to just kind of dismiss them and to trample on the idea of their rights. And I have always taken the approach that like, I want to show other people the same amount of patience that would have taken to reach me back when I was, had very different views from what I have now. And it does take that humanizing element to like bring people back down to reality and just engage with one another as real people.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, it's important to have caveats as well, because I mean, I wouldn't like if Gavin McInnes, and this has actually happened, if Gavin McInnes wanted to like engage in a debate with me, I'm going to reject it. Like, I know what kind of person Gavin McInnes is.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think there are people who are just, they've been in a filter bubble and they're not necessarily bad people, right? And when you look at gay marriage, for instance, I think the reason why we finally got to a place where gay marriage was legalized was because people started to come out to their family members. And all of a sudden, oh shit, I was against gay people until my child came out as gay, and like I love my child. And I know it didn't work out like that for everyone, but
Mm-hmm.
I do think that the culture started to change because it started to humanize people, right? Like it's a ridiculous sentence now that I say it out loud, but you get what I mean. Like
Yeah.
instead of seeing something in the abstract, all of a sudden it's very much part of your personal life, and it forces you to humanize something that's very much been dehumanized in right-wing media. So
Right.
I do think I think that it's the best strategy to just, yeah, that patience is tough. I mean, when we talk about the work, that's the work, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like when it comes to, just to link this back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, to when talking about like a worker movement or movements that will significantly improve the lives of people in the United States or around the world, like, you know, that relies on people power, and in order to have people power, you need to see people as people, like that, like that's like ground level. You need that first, and that
Yeah.
can be a real struggle for, I think, a lot of people on the left and the right.
Totally. I mean, when you look at the John Deere strikers, I read something about how about 40% of them are conservatives. And that doesn't, like, none of that matters once they're on the picket line and they're fighting together in solidarity for better working conditions, better pay.
Hmm.
And we're supposed to live in a country that values diversity, not just in terms of like race and our appearances, but also like diversity of thought. And as long as it's not the type of thinking that promotes or endorses violence or, you know, any type of hatred towards specific groups of people, like I can have a debate. I could have a debate with a conservative who's like, hey, I think this policy isn't the right way to go, I want to deregulate. I'll have that debate any day, as long as it's a good faith argument with someone who isn't promoting violence. But you know, the loudest, worst people get the most attention in the media, and I think that it just exacerbates this notion that Americans are far more divided than they really are. I mean, you look at the polling on various issues, and a lot of Americans agree on a lot of different topics, right? Especially when it comes to economic policy. And so, my project, and it's becoming more and more clear to me, for like the foreseeable future, is to go as hard as I can in mocking and minimizing the manufactured culture wars, and trying to like really call out the loudest voices in the media for how they're intentionally trying to distract all of us from the issues that really do matter and make a difference in our lives.
So when you say the manufactured culture wars, like what is a cult, what does the culture war mean to you, like in this context? Because
So there's
it's so vague when talking with so many different people.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are two buckets. And one bucket is a legitimate culture wars. I wouldn't call it manufactured. So, look, immigration is part of the culture war, you know, and I think that's a very legitimate issue that we need to fight the right wing on. When I say manufactured culture war, though, I'm specifically referring to the right wing manufacturing controversies about like schools teaching critical race theory, that kind of stuff. Or, I mean, the more clownish stuff that comes from them. Sorry, I don't know if I can.
You can swear. Don't worry.
Okay,
I swear all the time. I'm just being
okay.
on my best behavior for you.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, like the Dr. Seuss stuff or the War on Christmas, which is recycled every single year. Like, we have to mock that and not get sucked into it. Um, but the funny thing is, when you look at establishment or corporate Democrats, they always take the bait because they love to weigh in on that stuff. For them, that's an opportunity to avoid having to speak about economic solutions, which they certainly don't really fight for, right? So instead, like Terry McAuliffe, I love giving this example, that race was really centered on the critical race theory stuff. And the reason why is because Terry McAuliffe was just like a freaking milquetoast, lame Democratic politician, governor of Virginia. And so once you have his, you know, political opponent fearmonger about critical race theory and say things like, you know, parents should get to decide what their children learn in school, Terry McAuliffe had nothing else to fall back on but to just respond to him. And his response was something along the lines of, no, I don't think parents should decide, which is a terrible campaign message, by the way.
Yeah.
So he, again, had nothing substantive. He had nothing to point to in regard to improving the lives of people in his own state. And so Democrats engage in this just as much as Republicans do. Oftentimes, the context is they just take the bait because they want to take the bait. They have nothing else to point to. And I think the left is very different, like the actual left. People who do want to improve people's lives materially, who want to decommodify certain sectors of the economy. These are people who have solutions and want to fight for those solutions. It's just, either they get sucked into the DC machine and all of a sudden they go from being like fire breathers to like super weak themselves, or the few who want to make changes in Congress just don't have the capacity to do it with their small numbers,
Right. You got your Bernie Sanders having to bide like 50 years of time before most people outside of Washington D.C. know his name.
Yeah. Yep.
What role do you think like the complicity of the media plays in allowing the focus of the conversation to always be on, Mr. Potato Head has to drop the Mister? Like how like, because I tend to think I agree with you a lot of what you said there. Like there is this I think from lefty politicians in general, this almost a primordial need to like jump on like, oh, you're being hypocritical, and like it seems like you said, that is an effort to not address actual problems. Hypocrisy is like one of those arguments that like, to put it bluntly, I think it exists almost entirely just to score internet points at this point. It's just to like get a dunk on your opponent without actually having to make any prescriptive judgments for how to improve the world at all. And what role do you think the media plays in that? And how can we elevate the discourse a little bit?
Oof. How can we? I mean, I think that elevating the discourse is difficult to do when, the well-funded media, corporate media, really gets to run with whatever narrative they want. And that's the thing that frustrates me, right? I mean, if you, and I've kind of gotten past this question of like, are they incompetent or are they just evil? And no, they know what they're doing. They're not stupid. So, they're always going to publish material that questions social spending on ordinary people. But they never do the same thing when it comes to like corporate subsidies and things like that, or seed money for, one of Elon Musk's corporations. Like, yeah, I mean, I lost my train of thought a little bit because as you're asking that question, the hypocrisy thing, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hypocrisy thing is, that argument is a weak argument all around, whether you're someone on the right making a hypocrisy argument against the left or vice versa. No one cares about hypocrisy at the end of the day. When there's hypocrisy on your own side, you tend to diminish it or dismiss it. And same goes for your political opponents. I don't know if it's really used as like a cover for refusing to do anything substantive for people. But I do think that it's just like the easy gotcha that makes the person who's, lobbying those accusations feel good about themselves. But at the end of the day, it changes nothing. Again, like the real hard work is organizing or finding ways to support those who are trying to organize their workplaces, talking to people that you disagree with politically, planting seeds, being kind and patient with people who disagree with you. Like the hard work is the stuff that drives you crazy, right? The stuff that makes you exhausted at the end of the day. But that's the stuff that actually pays dividends. That's what we really need to engage in.
Yeah.
The gotchas and the, oh, you're hypocrites. I think if anything, it actually turns the other side off to our arguments even more, right? So I just think the winning way is to provide better alternatives for people.
Yeah.
And also, instead of like bringing up hypocrisy, bring up the fact that like, hey, I know that you guys are really up in arms about Mr. Potato Head right now, but hey, why don't we Why don't we ask Matt Gaetz what kind of legislation he's championed to actually improve your life? Looks like you're having a difficult time providing for your children because of your insanely low wages. Are the Mr. Potato Head scaremongers, addressing those issues at all? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
just find a way to bring it back to the fact that these elected officials aren't doing jack shit to improve your life and instead are just trying to inject fear into your daily lives about the others or people who have lifestyles that are just different from yours, you know?
Yeah, and to be clear, when I'm talking about like manufactured, like deliberate focusing on this hypocrisy, I guess what I'm in my head, what I'm thinking about is this being a next order of like running out the clock on a conversation. You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's just there to fill up time while looking like people are actually talking about topics. Because like when you start talking about the Mr. Potato Head, well, then you have to start you get into like the whole like what are the business practices of the Potato Head company, and like it just that takes time, and that's time that could be spent talking about important issues. And I think that time is what they're really looking to kind of waste while having that veneer of doing something.
Yeah, I mean the Mr. Potato Head stuff or the Dr. Seuss stuff, I would just mock it and move on,
Yep.
right? Don't spend any time debating it. There's nothing to debate. And it'd be like, for me personally, if I'm confronted with a conservative who's like genuinely worried about like, oh, Mr. Potato, like, this is going to change our culture or something, I'd be like, listen, bro, like, we need to make people whole right now. Like, how about that? How about we ensure that our kids can go to college, that we all have roofs over our heads, that we have a warm meal to come home to, that we're all paid and working in safe conditions. Like, let's get that important stuff, the bread and butter stuff out of the way. And then once we're living lives that are whole and happy and healthy, then maybe we can get into a debate about something as ridiculous as Mr. Potato Head. But for now, I feel like that's not the most important issue. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
just immediately diminish it, because dismiss it, because it's such an intentional distraction, and it drives me nuts that it turns into like a story for I don't know how many days in a row, maybe a week in a row, and it's like, this is not a thing, guys. Like, it's very obviously manufactured by the right wing to distract us, and people take the bait always.
Yep. um so here's a question. When you look at a path forward to socialism, you mentioned earlier that you know you kind of couldn't imagine an America without capitalism.
Hmm.
How do you see like what do you see as the most effective way to paint an imagination for other people?
Hmm.
How do you get other people to the point where they can imagine a better future with a different system?
Right. So I really think that's like relying on labels hurts us, because when you say, oh, I want a socialist society or capitalist society, we're never going to have we're always going to have a place for markets in this country.
Hmm.
Always. That's never going to change. And by the way, I'm fine with that. It's just the question is, what are we willing to decommodify? What needs to be decommodified? So I want to see pretty significant sectors of the economy decommodified, specifically things that have to do with basic human rights,
Hmm.
food, shelter, obviously healthcare, something we talk about a lot. But in my ideal society, when it comes to things that might be considered luxury items or whatever, cool. I think that there should be a private market for that. But I would like to see those companies owned by their workers, or if they're not owned by the workers, I'd like to see, strong union representation in those companies. So I think being a little more precise
Hmm.
in how we would ideally see our society could be helpful, because when you say things like, I want socialism, people do immediately think about Cuba or
Yep.
Venezuela, and I don't think that that really helps us, right? Now, of course, I do think that there's also a lot of like fear mongering and lies about the situation in Cuba and all of that. But putting that aside, You want to think about the most effective way in communicating. And sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I feel like the left is more interested in like engaging in their purity wars instead of like actually being effective. So it's like, no, but I'm the most socialist and I'm actually a communist. It's like, just shut the fuck up. Like, that's not, no one outside of your cute little bubble finds your little argument here appealing, right?
Or
So,
even relevant. Like
or even relevant.
most
Yeah,
people don't even know the distinction between socialism and communism. It
totally.
like to most people they're interchangeable, and like it is irrelevant outside of extremely lefty circles. Like, you talk to like a normal person on the street, they don't know what a tanky is. Like,
Yeah, totally.
like uh, we're we're politically brain poisoned. Like it's too late for us. But the normies, they don't know. They don't know these things.
My in-laws are Cuban, and they fled Cuba during the revolution, so they're not very I mean, they're not very warm to the idea of socialism in America. However, it's interesting. Once I get rid of labels and we
Mm-hmm.
start talking about specific sectors of the economy, like let's say healthcare, and I start talking about how I'd like to see healthcare in America change without using any type of socialism, socialized, or anything, all of a sudden they're on board,
Yeah,
right? And so we need to think strategically. We have to communicate precisely, and just take note of what works and what doesn't work, and also take ego out of it, right? You proving to your peers that you're the most socialist is not helping anyone other than your own ego. I don't care what my label is. Like sometimes people will ask me, like, do you consider yourself a socialist? I don't know, and I don't care. What
mm-hmm.
I know is precisely how I'd like to see our economy change. And part of that involves socializing sectors of the economy while keeping other, private businesses intact with more workers' rights injected into that equation.
Yeah.
Then so yeah, that's where I'm at. And so if certain terms scare people, avoid using those terms. We know that the actual policies are popular.
Exactly. Like focusing on the policies definitely seems, at least in my experience talking about politics online, seems to be the most effective way to like reach people. Like I've had conversations with people who identify as like theological conservatives, and like, you talk with them and they're like, yeah, I think workers should be able to like band together and collectively own a company. It's like, well, cool. That,
Yeah.
I'm glad we can reach that level of agreement, even if we disagree on a bunch of other things. Um, there are ways, especially when you take labels out and just kind of talk about the policies, to reach a huge number of people, because fundamentally I think people like democracy. And
Yeah.
when you talk about policies that encourage like democracy in the workplace, or get like people thinking about, hey, we do live in a democratic country, but it is kind of weird that we all work for, these kind of totalitarian structures, um, and like, because everyone has like that experience with a boss who's told them to do something completely unreasonable.
Right.
And I think there is some degree of commonality between a bunch of us when it comes to issues of fairness, issues of wishing we had more representation in our workplace, wishing we had more say in how the place we work was run. And I think that that's something that touches everybody, regardless of how they identify.
Exactly. I totally agree with you on that. And it's again being able to differentiate between the bad faith actors who are just toxic and like seem to be 100% fueled by hate. Those people exist. And I think it would be wrong to lump them in with the individuals that we're talking about. The conservatives that I'm referring to are, I think, not only like reasonable people if you're willing to talk to them, but also gettable in that you could even persuade them to come to your side. But just automatically demonizing them because they listen to Ben Shapiro's podcast, I think is the wrong way to go. I actually think that you know, especially the response that I got from Ben Shapiro's audience after debating him, they're gettable in
Oh
the
yeah.
best possible way, you know? And I will say, like, the thing that shocked me was just like how many messages I got from his audience saying things like, hey, you know, I, you know, disagree with you on the majority of things, but you made some really interesting points on A, B, and C. And it was like, oh my God, it was so worth it because it's planting a seed, right?
Yeah.
Because we do have commonalities, we do have shared lived experiences. And like, I know this is super Pollyannish and I don't know if we'll ever get there, but like, I want to get back to a place where, like, well, I don't know if we've ever had it, but I want to get as close to a culture in America where we just like genuinely look out for each other and respect each other, even if we might disagree politically.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that because I think that there are a lot of conservatives who are in, Dave Rubin's audience or in Ben Shapiro's audience, and like when you actually look at the rhetoric Ben Shapiro is offering and the ideas Ben Shapiro is offering, or the high level ideas Dave Rubin is offering, I think that there are a lot of people who notice the gaps in those ideas in that rhetoric, but because they're in kind of like the bubble with Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire, cast of characters, they never really question it. And so when you have somebody who comes on like you, and I watched your debate with Ben Shapiro, I thought you did great,
Thank
specifically
you.
because you didn't like you said, you didn't engage with like the manufactured uh, outrage machine. Instead, you got down to like brass tacks on like issues that actually affect people and
Mhm.
pointed out the gaps where conservative ideas fail a lot of people, especially if they're not ultra wealthy.
Mm.
And the vast majority of people in Dave Rubin's audience, in Ben Shapiro's audience, in conservative audiences aren't ultra wealthy people.
Right. Right. Exactly. I mean, I think that there's if you pay close attention to that exchange with Shapiro, I think it's kind of obvious that he and I were engaging in this like tug of war where I wanted the debate to really focus on economic issues. He wanted to go back to CRT and immigration and that kind of stuff. Not to say that immigration isn't an important issue,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a reason why he wants to lean into that because it's far easier for him to inject fear, which
It's
it
powerful.
does. It's powerful. It really is. It's a powerful emotion, especially at a time when a lot of Americans are experiencing economic anxiety. So the idea of immigration is terrifying to them, not only because of like the xenophobia and all that stuff that's spewed on conservative media, but because they genuinely think like, oh my God, I only have scraps left, and now immigrants are going to come in and take the scraps. That's the thinking. And so the only way that you can alleviate that fear or counter that fear is to improve people's conditions, like material conditions.
Mm-hmm. Agreed 100%. Also, just massive respect to you for going into what you knew was going to be a hostile debate environment. Like that is always really really difficult. Like I have a lot of respect for college kids who go and like, counter Ben Shapiro at one of his engagements and there's a crowd of people around who are hostile to them, and like not only were you in a similar situation, but like the moderator of your debate was very clearly not on your side, and the entire room is filled with relatively influential, wealthy people who are also definitely not on your side, and just a lot of respect to you for putting yourself out there like that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I just try to think of it as I'm not here to persuade this audience. I'm here to persuade people who might come across this video. And luckily, I do think that some seeds were planted.
Yeah.
So we'll see if anything germinates.
Well, I know you have to run. I don't want to make you late for anything. Um,
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. I'm happy that we were able to do it. And you know, once things calm down, hopefully we can do it again.
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I think what you do is so important. I mean, you're providing a voice for, I think, a lot of people who might feel alone and scared. And that takes a lot of courage too. So thanks for doing what you do.
Well, thank you. I hope you have a lovely day, and you're welcome to come back anytime. I really enjoyed this conversation, and yeah, I hope you have a great day.
You too. Have a good one.
See ya.
Bye.
That was such a good conversation.